how do specs do DPS in Mythic Plus, and what type of DPS is considered valuable in a key. This is what we are exploring today after what we looked at yesterday, once we surprisingly noted that two of the better performers last week in Mythic Plus were, surprisingly, Elemental Shaman and Unholy Death Knight, not exactly some notorious top performers in Mythic Plus. We noted, interestingly enough, that even though both of them started doing super well, each of them had a completely different type of damage profile from one another. Damage profile meaning simply, how do you do damage? Do you do damage with super high burst on a few number of targets? Is it super high burst on many targets? Is it consistent damage for a longer period of time? And there are right now, let's just say, two parties. There are two factions. There is the faction that can do damage to many targets for a reasonably consistent amount of time. You have Shadow Priest, you have Destruction, and you have Unholy Death Knight right now amongst the top performers in Mythic Plus. The damage is not all the same, we will see very quickly. Some specs can do high burst damage quickly to many targets, others can do consistent damage that takes longer to go online, but they can hit upwards of 20 targets without having any diminishing returns. And then you have the other side of the coin with specs like BM. Specs like Marksmanship, like Elemental, like Retribution. These are specs that can do high upfront damage, high burst damage without nearly as much of a ramp up period. Most of these specs are also more limited by numbers. They don't have nearly as easy of a time to hit 20 mobs as easily as a Destruction Warlock can, for example, or an Unholy Death Knight. So they have burst damage that is limited by the amount of targets. And before we go into exploring what this means, here are some examples to better understand the types of damage. You can see here a plus 18 Ruby Life Pulse with a Shadow Priest on the first big pull. Then we have a 17 Ruby Life Pulse first big pull with a Desert Warlock, and then a 15 with a BM Hunter. You can see the BM Hunter doing 2.2 million DPS, the Warlock breaking the 5.5 million DPS, and the Priest getting closer to 4 million DPS. In this case, you can find multiple differences. The difference of the Priest, for example, is that they have a longer ramp-up time before they do their damage. Not only are they laying down, multiple GCDs worth of Vampiric Touches before then, and then also Shadow Crash, and then also Void Eruption, and then they finally get to start their piano performance of these three abilities over and over, which is slower. It takes more time and longer to ramp up. On top of that, Shadow Priest is also gated by their Shadow Crash. The biggest disclaimer to see if a Shadow Priest can do top damage is if the pack of mobs, the big pull you're doing, can last at least 2 Shadow Crashes. Because Shadow Crash is what applies Vampiric Touch and Shadow War Pain to 8 different targets. So you want to use it on pull, and then you want to use it 20 seconds later, hopefully with the pull still well and alive, so you can continue to do your damage. If that doesn't happen, you might end up having pathetic situations like this one. You are in a pool on Azure Vault, you start your Vampiric Touch casts, and then you go into Shadow Crash, into Void Eruption, your PI, your cooldowns, even your Trinket, you start doing your damage, you have your Shadow Crash on cooldown still, there is 10 seconds left, you continue to do your rotation, Shadow Crash is almost about to come back off cooldown, it's time to use it now, and the pack is dead. And then you enter the pathetic and sad situation every priest knows, where the pack is dead and you still have 10 seconds left on your Void Eruption, on your Void form, and it's just slowly and depressingly fading out. You can see it just about the same in a pool like this one, same thing, plus 11 Ruby Life Pools, first pool, you see the Shadow Priest starting to ramp up massively in damage, but then it doesn't matter because the pack is already dead. Because the key is too small, the mob HP is too short, the pool was too small, meaning you don't have time to ramp as a Shadow Priest. But if you do have, right, if you do have the time for the pool to be long enough, you get to ramp over time and still do your damage. That is why it is often mentioned that the power of, for example, Shadow Priest is only effective once you reach the level of keys where mobs can stay alive long enough for you to do this kind of pulls. If the key is too small, then multiple other specs like Arms Warrior, Devastation Evoker, Windwalker Monk, Frost Mage, all of these can beat or match or fight with a Shadow Priest in terms of damage. Destruction Warlock is also in a similar situation, not nearly as problematic, because unlike Shadow Priest, Destruction doesn't have nearly as big of a ramp-up time. As you can see here, it's just, casually land 1, 2, or 3 Immolets before you pop your CDs, your Infernal, your Trinkets, and then just do some Destruction gaming. Just go from 040 to 103, just go 23 seconds clicking Just Rain of Fire. That's the whole thing. And this amazing feat of skill is going to net you a ridiculous 5.6 million DPS. And by the way, this isn't even 5.6 million DPS boosted by an Augmentation Evoker. This was flat out with no AUG help, besides just a power infusion. So Destro is similar to Priest in the amount of targets they can hit. Is similar to Priest in the big pool value of Destro. It is not similar to Priest in how fast they are in actually spiking up their damage, for Destro is only 2-3 seconds before they can go online, as opposed to Shadow Priest. So even in the shorter pools, Destro doesn't suffer nearly as much as Shadow, because they don't require nearly as much of a ramp-up period, or they don't suffer nearly as much from not being able to land some of their abilities a second time to spread more dots, etc, etc. Talking about upfront on-demand damage, you have BM Hunter. If Shadow Priest was slow and Destro was somewhat quick, BM Hunter is almost instant. The tank is grouping up the mobs, so the BM Hunter is just landing a couple of barb shots, and then once the mobs are grouped, you pop all of your cooldowns in a couple of GCDs, and then it's damage gaming. That's it. The ramp-up time of the BM Hunter was just a couple of seconds, and then he was just ready to go with the damage. You can see it better when you compare it with the rest of the damage in his group, which also included a Shadow Priest, and the damage is self-explanatory. BM Hunter just does damage instantly. Shadow Priest takes, 10 to 15 seconds before they actually get to do their damage. And then the pool needs to last long enough for the Shadow Priest to be able to continue this damage for even longer. This can be shown even better if you go even lower down in key difficulty. If you go down to a plus 11, again, you have a BM Hunter smoking both a Shadow and a Destruction Warlock. The reason why they are getting smoked is because the BM Hunter is just soaking up all the early damage, as the other two specs are not doing nearly as much. A different type of damage profile in Mythic Plus is the burst damage, with very low ramp-up time, which would be, in our example, the very popular Retribution Paladin. Red Paladin's damage is quite short, because as you begin your damage, you have a grand total of, 4 GCDs, as again, the tank is grouping up the mobs before it's time to go and do some gaming. When it's time to go and do some gaming, just make sure to bubble yourself, because of the amount of aggro you will pull on your burst. Put up all of your CDs up front, your Wake of Ashes, your Divine Toll, Potion, Final Reckoning, and then just, do your damage. This results in Red Paladin having, very high bursts normally. This is the other example. Here is Red and their burst, and here is Shadow Priest and their consistent damage later on. An even more hilarious example is here, where we congratulate the Red Paladin big dicking himself to reaching 7 million burst DPS damage. That's pretty cool. Problem is, this is now a 16, the pool is 1 minute long, and the Shadow Priest can just consistently do more damage later on. After the initial burst is over, Shadow Priest will consistently reach nearly twice the DPS of the Red Paladin. In some cases, almost nearing 3 times DPS of the Red Paladin, consistently. We're talking about from 40 seconds into the pool, well into 1 minute, over 20 seconds long of double damage of the Shadow Priest. That's because a lot of the red damage was here, where he did 35 million of his damage while the Priest did 4. That's another kind of upfront damage. You have the damage of Ret, which is very upfront and then slows down quite a lot. You have the damage of a BM Hunter, which is upfront for a longer duration than Ret, but nowhere near as high. We mentioned Ret being able to reach numbers like, even 7 million DPS burst. BM Hunter is never going to reach that high, but it can last a little bit longer than Ret's damage. And then you have, as mentioned, specs like Shadow and Destruction being able to last for much longer. We mentioned yesterday, we made the example of Unholy being of a similar kind of these two specs in terms of how many targets can they hit with their damage. And the other example we had yesterday was Elemental. Elemental was closer to the Beast Mastery variety. They don't have a very high burst damage like Ret, for example, or even Devastation, maybe even Havoc, Demon Hunter, but their damage is more consistent. It's not cooldown based. They are not based around some massive, infernal cooldown like other specs. And similar to these other specs, they are target capped. They don't do well hitting more than 6 to 8 targets like specs like Unholy, Destruction, or Shadow can do. And those are the top performers right now in Mythic Plus. It's it's nice, it's knowledgeable to be able to pinpoint which type of damage each of these specs can do, and also why might the experiences for the majority of the player base feel different than what top players or streamers might say or mention, or you might see yourself in the keys being streamed, for example, where mentions of Destro being insane in a plus 18, and then you go home, you do your plus 12 weekly, and there is a random Arms Warrior completely gapping a Destruction Warlock. That's because if you're pulling 6 mobs at a time who are going to die in 15 seconds, Arms is just going to be better than these two specs, for example. So it does depend on your damage profile. It does depend on how quickly you get to do your damage. So quick categories are specs like Arms, specs like Havoc, specs like Marksmanship Hunter, Retribution Paladin, BM Hunter, even Devastation Evoker's burst cooldowns are very quick compared to other specs who are slower. Shadow Priest, Destruction, even Demonology, but also Unholy DK or Elemental Shaman are either slow or they are slow plus consistent. Consistent longer damage over time like Elemental or even Enhancement or Frost Mage, compared to other specs with higher burst like Unholy DK, and then the amount of targets. You have certain specs like Shadow, Destruction, Unholy, also Frost Mage, and Balanced Druid, which can hit multiple targets quite well, and then other specs which are more target capped. They don't do nearly as well as the pools get bigger and bigger and bigger. So Marksmanship, Elemental, Red Paladin, BM, Outlaw Rogue, Arms Warrior, all belong to this category. That's how damage profiles are divided right now in Mythic Plus, what makes each of these kinds of damage profiles powerful, and also when, depending on the key level, depending on the amount of targets being pulled by your tank, and also how long do these targets get to stay alive for certain damage profiles to be better than others. So I thought this was relevant to point out, just in case players don't get confused whenever one mentioned, this spec being great in Mythic Plus, someone else answering, no, this one does top DPS in my keys. No, actually, I've only ever seen this spec do terrible in my keys. Very often, it might have to do with the key level you are at, the amount of targets being pulled, how long the fight lasts, etc., etc. So this was our exploration of the damage profiles in Mythic Plus, going down right now in Season 4 of Dragonflight. With this informational video now out of the way, hoping that it might have enlightened even some of you on how things are going down right now in Mythic Plus, we are now leaving each other on this Thursday. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Thanks, of course, as usual. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, how to be slow. How did I take 6 hours to make this video?